That night, I woke up from a strange dream. In it, I stood in an empty room surrounded by shadows. Suddenly, Jason emerged from the darkness. His face was calm, but his eyes held a determination that sent a shiver through me. He came closer, so close I could feel his breath. Jason leaned in and kissed me. At first, the kiss was soft, almost hesitant, but then it grew insistent. His hand slid down, lifting the edge of my skirt and lingering at the front. I froze. A whirlwind of shock, fear, and something irresistibly magnetic surged through me. I stood there, suspended in the moment, until I suddenly jolted awake. My heart was racing, my body unresponsive. Sitting up in bed, I tried to steady my breathing. It was just a dream, I told myself, but the lingering sensations refused to fade. Something deep inside me had stirred, something I couldn't ignore. The next day, Jason arrived at our home. He was staying with us temporarily while searching for a new job. When I opened the door to greet him, a strange tension flared inside me. His welcoming smile was warm, but his gaze seemed to linger on every movement I made. I tried to act naturally, blaming my unease on the vivid nightmare from the night before. David, my husband, was his usual gracious self. Over dinner, he kept the conversation flowing, asking Jason about his plans. Jason spoke about life after college, mentioning that he often felt unaccepted and adding sarcastically, "But that's okay. Not everyone has an idyllic life like you two." David chuckled nervously while I found myself staring at Jason for too long. His voice was calm, almost mesmerizing, and I felt as though every word was meant just for me. After dinner, I cleared the table and went upstairs. Lying in bed beside David, I struggled to fall asleep. Jason's image lingered in my mind, and the touch from the dream felt all too real. What is happening to me, I wondered, but I had no answer. David was preparing for his business trip. In the morning, before leaving, he handed me the car keys and a list of things to do, tasks I always found a little exhausting. Not because they were hard, but because they revealed his habit of wanting to control everything. "Viv, you'll be fine with the house, right?" he asked, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Jason can help if needed." I nodded. He hugged me briefly before heading out. As his car disappeared down the street, the house fell into an unfamiliar silence. It was just me and Jason now. I always started my mornings with yoga. Wearing my favorite fitted workout outfit, I rolled out my mat on the terrace. The slow, rhythmic movements and deep breaths usually calmed me, but today I felt a gaze on me. Turning my head, I saw Jason standing in the doorway. His eyes flicked over me casually, almost as if by accident, but his glance lingered just a little too long. I pretended not to notice, though tension crept into my every move. When I finished and went back inside, Jason was already in the kitchen. "Need help with breakfast?" he offered, pulling eggs from the fridge. "Sure, why not?" I shrugged, trying to appear indifferent, though my heart was racing. We cooked together, but the conversation shifted to more personal topics. "You've always been so confident," he said suddenly, looking up. "Even in the smallest things. I've always admired that about you." I froze. His words caught me off guard. "Confident? I don't think that's really me," I mumbled, feeling warmth rise to my cheeks. He didn't respond, but his gaze, steady and warm, spoke volumes. That evening, we decided to watch a movie. Jason picked an old classic and we settled in the living room. I sat on the couch, but he sat closer than I expected. There was a small gap between us, yet the tension was unmistakable. Every subtle movement he made, every pause in the film, made my heart skip a beat. I tried to focus on the screen, but it felt like the entire world had shrunk to the space between us. This day revealed something new, and at the same time it cracked something I thought was unbreakable. The forest had always been my sanctuary, a place to escape the noise in my mind. When Jason suggested a walk, I agreed without hesitation. We walked along a path covered in fallen leaves, enveloped in silence. Even nature seemed to hold its breath as if waiting for something to unfold. The sound of a river came into focus. I stopped by its bank, taking a deep breath. Moments like these usually made me feel grounded, but today, peace eluded me. The weight of thoughts I had tried to leave at home clung to me. An emptiness had been growing inside me lately, though I couldn't pinpoint its cause. Jason stood nearby. His presence felt almost tangible. I could sense his gaze lingering on me, not out of casual curiosity, but something more deliberate, something that unnerved me. The silence between us thickened as I perched on a large rock by the water. Jason settled close by. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden patterns across his face. The scene was serene, yet my mind was a storm. Suddenly, he leaned closer. I felt his warmth before his lips met mine. The kiss caught me off guard, not forceful but undeniable. It was a moment suspended in time, unreal yet electric. I pulled away, stunned. My heart pounded wildly, but beneath the shock was an undeniable feeling. Desire. I couldn't let this continue. Standing abruptly, I turned and walked back without looking at him. When I returned home, the memory of what had happened clung to me. I knew it was wrong, and yet a part of me whispered that I had wanted it. David returned unexpectedly while I was in the middle of my daily chores. Seeing him at the door with a gift in hand caught me off guard. A wave of familiar warmth swept over me, but instead of joy, I felt a sharp pang of guilt. I forced a smile to mask my unease. Inside the small box was a delicate silver necklace with a slender pendant. David always knew what I liked, and this gift was another reminder of his thoughtfulness. I thanked him, but the guilt gnawed deeper. He noticed my distraction but said nothing, only giving me a look that seemed to question what was wrong. We spent the evening together. David shared stories about his trip, his colleagues, and work. His voice was warm, his demeanor open, but my mind wandered. I tried to focus, to stay present, but memories of the forest, the river, and Jason's kiss refused to fade. Each moment I spent with David only made the weight of my thoughts heavier. Later, when we went upstairs, David held me close, his touch tender and familiar. Yet I felt no spark, no connection. My body seemed to retreat, unwilling to respond. He noticed, though he said nothing. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but he didn't press further. Lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what was happening to me. Just days ago, I had been certain of our relationship, but now everything felt distant, alien. I tried to push thoughts of Jason away, but his image returned relentlessly. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, inexplicable. The next morning, I woke early. David was still asleep as I slipped out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. The emptiness inside me lingered, a gnawing void I couldn't ignore. I knew I had to regain control, but the cracks in my reality were growing. When Jason entered the room, I tensed. He looked as composed as ever, calm and confident, as if nothing had happened. I avoided his gaze, burying myself in household tasks, but his presence was overwhelming. Every move he made felt amplified, drawing my attention no matter how hard I tried to resist. To escape, I left for errands. Driving through town, I tried to clear my mind, but thoughts of Jason lingered. His silence about what had happened was louder than any words could be. When I returned, David was already absorbed in his work. Our eyes met briefly, and I could tell he sensed something. Though he couldn't articulate it, the seeds of suspicion had been planted. Between us, an invisible wall had risen, one I didn't know how to break. All day I felt like I was on edge. Jason stayed somewhere nearby, but I avoided him at all costs. It was my only way to shield myself from the emotions that were growing stronger. But even as I avoided him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when I couldn't see him. That evening, I locked myself in the bathroom, turned on the faucet to drown out the sound of my quiet sobs. I couldn't understand how everything I had built over the years was starting to crumble, and I didn't know how to stop it. Late at night, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up with a message from Jason. "I can't forget what happened." I froze, staring at the screen. The words were simple, yet they carried so much more. My heart raced, and a whirlwind of emotions churned inside me. My fingers hovered over the phone. Should I reply? Delete it? Ignore it entirely? After several minutes, I pressed delete. But even after erasing it, the message remained etched in my mind like an indelible mark. The next morning, Jason offered to help me with the gardening. I couldn't refuse, though his presence stirred a storm of conflicting emotions within me. We worked in silence for a while before he broke it. "Do you enjoy taking care of the garden?" he asked, his voice carrying a subtle undertone that made me wary. "It helps me clear my mind," I replied without looking at him. His silence spoke volumes. It felt like he was waiting for me to say more, but I refused to indulge him. The unspoken words between us lingered in the air, thickening the tension. Later in the day, I went into the guest bedroom to put away some freshly folded laundry. Hearing footsteps behind me, I turned to see Jason standing in the doorway. His expression was heavy, intense. "Do you need something?" I asked, trying to sound firm, though my voice betrayed a slight tremor. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The space between us was small, but the tension filled the entire room. His eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, questioning. I felt control slipping away. The distance between us seemed to vanish as he moved closer. His hand brushed against mine, and the light touch sent a jolt through me. I knew I should stop him, walk away, but I couldn't move. He leaned in slowly, so slowly that I felt every second stretch into eternity. When his lips met mine, I didn't pull back. The kiss was restrained, brimming with emotions we both tried to suppress. We stepped back, but the tension remained. I knew it was wrong, but in that moment I lacked the strength to fight it. He left the room without a word, leaving me standing there, battling the turmoil within myself. David suggested spending the weekend at a countryside house. It was his way of pulling us out of our everyday routines. The house stood at the edge of a forest, with a large pool surrounded by a cozy deck. The scenery promised peace, but inside I was anything but calm. I agreed, hoping the change of pace would help me collect my thoughts. We arrived in the morning, and David immediately busied himself preparing dinner. I decided to take a walk around the pool, seeking some inner calm. But his presence, Jason, was impossible to ignore. He approached me as if waiting for the moment when we'd be alone. "Nice place, isn't it?" he said casually, not expecting an answer. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. The silence between us became suffocating. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone calm yet insistent. "It's for the best," I replied curtly, refusing to look at him. "Is it?" His voice carried a challenge. "Because it seems a lot more complicated than you're willing to admit." His words hit a nerve. I turned, meeting his gaze. "Jason, you need to understand, this is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Wrong?" He stepped closer, his confidence almost maddening. "Is it wrong for me to feel this way about you? Or for you to look at me the way you do?" Anger flared in me. His certainty felt like a provocation, a deliberate attempt to unravel the fragile control I clung to. "Stop it, we can't do this," I said, though my words sounded weak even to myself. Jason stepped closer, the space between us shrinking to nothing. His eyes held mine, and I knew I couldn't resist. He leaned in, and his lips met mine. This kiss was different, intense, raw, charged with everything we had kept bottled up. It wasn't just a mistake, it was an admission. I felt control slipping away, everything I had tried to hold back collapsing in an instant. We didn't hear David approach until it was almost too late. I pulled away sharply, my heart pounding as I realized how close we'd come to being caught. But thankfully, he seemed oblivious. "Dinner's almost ready. You two exploring the place?" he asked with a smile, glancing between us. I forced a tight-lipped smile, struggling to mask my turmoil. Jason, ever composed, acted as if nothing had happened. But inside I was on fire. Shame, fear, and a strange, unbearable longing all roiled within me. Throughout the evening, I avoided Jason as much as possible. But his presence felt deafening, even in silence. Our eyes met across the room, and every time it was a reminder of what we had done. I knew there was no turning back now. My life was slowly unraveling, slipping from the order I had always known. Each day began with a renewed determination to fix things, to bring myself back to a familiar reality. But inside, everything was falling apart. Thoughts of Jason crept in constantly, uninvited, displacing everything else. I tried to convince myself that I was in control. After all, I was doing what I was supposed to, managing the house, spending time with David, being the attentive and caring wife. But every action felt strained, like a thin thread ready to snap at any moment. During the day, David suggested we spend some time together, and I agreed, hoping it would help me regain balance. We went to the park, strolled through the paths, and talked about small things. He was trying, I could see that, but his efforts left me indifferent. Each time he held my hand or laughed, a hollow ache grew inside me. I looked at him and tried to remember what it felt like to be fully present with him. His touch had once warmed me. His voice had been a source of comfort. Now it all felt distant, almost foreign. That evening at dinner, I forced myself to smile, to keep up the conversation. But in my mind, another voice, another laugh, kept replaying. I caught myself wondering about Jason, where he was, what he was thinking, and how he had come to occupy so much space in my life. When David fell asleep, I was left alone in the bedroom. The silence of the house was almost suffocating, but I didn't dare break it. Then my phone vibrated. The screen lit up the darkness, and I immediately saw his name, Jason. The message was brief, but every word burned into me. "I want to see you. Tonight." I stared at the screen for a long time, a whirlwind of emotions swelling inside me. My first instinct was to delete the message, to pretend it had never existed. But instead, I gripped the phone tightly in my hand, unable to make a decision. That night stretched endlessly. The question I had been avoiding grew louder. Could I even stop what had already begun? I spent hours debating what to do. Jason's message lingered in my mind, but I knew I had to focus on David. He deserved that much. The idea of spending the evening with him felt like the right decision, a way to reclaim my old life. I prepared dinner, something special, something we rarely indulged in because of our busy schedules. Candles, wine, the soft glow of the lamps. All of it was meant to restore the atmosphere that had long since faded from our relationship. David smiled when he saw the effort I had put in. His warmth, always so genuine, melted the ice inside me, if only for a moment. He talked about work, about how much he missed our evenings together. I listened, nodded, but my thoughts still wandered. After dinner, we went upstairs. I knew what he wanted: intimacy, something we hadn't shared in a long time. I decided not to pull away, to give this a chance. His touch was gentle, familiar, but it didn't stir the feelings it once had. With each of his movements, my mind drifted further away. Instead of warmth or desire, I felt emptiness. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine things differently, but images of Jason filled my thoughts. His gaze, his confidence, his strength. This moment became a turning point for me. I realized I couldn't keep lying, to myself or to David. My feelings for him had changed. The next day, I did everything I could to avoid Jason. Every time I heard his footsteps in the house, I moved to another room. It felt like avoiding him might help me regain control, but deep down, I knew it was an illusion. Things had gone too far. My pull toward Jason didn't fade. The harder I fought, the clearer it became that reclaiming my old life was no longer possible. David was starting to notice. His attention, usually scattered between work and household tasks, suddenly focused on me. I caught his gaze lingering, watching my every move, every time I passed by or turned away. He didn't ask direct questions, but his presence spoke volumes. That morning at breakfast, he observed me longer than usual. I tried to act as I always did, attentive, smiling, but it felt like a performance. He didn't need words to convey his growing unease. His silence was enough. Later, Julia came by. At first, her visit brought a sense of relief, someone to distract me from my thoughts, but her sharp eyes quickly unsettled me. She noticed everything. Her words were carefully chosen, indirect but heavy with implication. Each comment, each observation seemed to peel away the layers I had tried so hard to maintain. That evening, Jason found me in the hallway while David was in his office. His steps were quiet, his presence deliberate. I tried to pass him, pretending to be busy, but he blocked my path. His eyes said everything. He was done hiding. Every glance, every movement reminded me that he wouldn't back down. The tension between us felt almost physical, as if the air itself was charged. When David emerged from the office, it happened too quickly. Jason and I stepped apart, pretending nothing had happened. But I saw it in David's expression. He felt something was off. Later that night, as we lay in bed, I watched him stare at his phone for what felt like hours. He didn't say a word, but the silence was louder than any accusation. It screamed that he had started noticing more than he wanted to. My life felt like a web tightening around me, and within that web, electrified and inescapable, was Jason, his certainty, his refusal to stop. The day began as usual. David came down to the kitchen, grabbed his coffee, and I busied myself with small tasks. We exchanged brief glances, but no words. The tension between us was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. After breakfast, I left my phone on the table, forgetting it in my rush to head upstairs and put away some laundry. A simple oversight, yet it changed everything. When I returned, David was standing at the table holding my phone. His face was expressionless, almost a mask, but his eyes betrayed emotions I couldn't quite place. I knew immediately what had happened, even before I could ask. He held up the screen and I saw the message. "You were amazing." Jason's words seared into me. My breath caught and the room seemed to spin. Time froze. David didn't yell. His silence was far worse. It was deafening, devastating. I could see his chest rise and fall, the restrained anger and pain building inside him. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. How do you explain the inexcusable? David set the phone down on the table. He didn't look at me, as though everything between us had already dissolved into nothing. His shoulders slumped, and I saw something break in him. I knew there was no point in denying it. He wasn't a fool, and the evidence was undeniable. The rest of the day passed in silence. He retreated to his office without a word, leaving me in the kitchen with my spiraling thoughts. Every moment felt like an eternity. I knew I couldn't hide anymore. It was all over. That evening, he emerged from his office and stopped at the doorway. His gaze met mine, filled with pain but devoid of anger. It was something worse. Disappointment, emptiness. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked away. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Everything we had built over the years had crumbled in an instant. I knew I had to make a choice, but its inevitability terrified me. Over and over, I tried to think of what I could say to explain myself. But there was nothing. Inside, I was hollow. By morning, I understood there was no going back. I had shattered his trust, destroyed the foundation of our relationship. Now, all that was left was to face the consequences. The house was enveloped in a profound silence. David had left in the morning without saying a word. I knew he was avoiding me, perhaps trying to process everything that had happened. Each step I took through the empty rooms echoed in my mind. The space felt cold and detached, as if all the warmth that once filled this home had left along with his trust. I tried to busy myself with routine tasks, dusting shelves, rearranging old items in the closets, anything to distract myself. But every object I touched only reminded me of how far I had fallen. Inside, I felt hollow, as though someone had taken everything real and left me with nothing. Midday, a knock broke the stillness. My heart clenched. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Jason stood there. His gaze was resolute, his hand steady, as if he had already made the decision for both of us. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door, unable to find words. His presence filled the house, making the air heavy. He stopped in the middle of the room and turned to face me, his eyes studying every detail of my face. "You don't have to torture yourself," he began, his voice soft but firm. "What's between us is real. You feel it as much as I do." I wanted to respond, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped closer, his energy overwhelming, as if the entire world had narrowed to just the two of us. "You can be honest with yourself," he continued. "You don't have to destroy everything. We can keep this going. Nothing has to change. No one will ever know." His confidence unsettled me. He spoke calmly, as though proposing something ordinary, but I knew it was far from that. This choice wasn't just difficult, it was excruciating. "Jason, you don't understand," I finally whispered, feeling the weight of everything crashing down. "This isn't just about us. It's about my life, his life." "And what about your life?" His voice sharpened, his gaze growing more intense. "Are you happy, or are you just pretending?" I turned away, trying to avoid his eyes, but his words lingered in my mind. He didn't back down, stepping even closer. "You can lie to yourself. but it doesn't change what's happening between us. You know that." I closed my eyes, struggling against the tide of emotions. His words held a truth I was too afraid to face. This wasn't just an infatuation, not a fleeting passion. It was something deeper, something I couldn't even explain to myself. When he left, the house once again fell into silence, but now it felt unbearable. I sat by the window, staring at the gray sky. The day stretched endlessly, each moment filled with doubt and memories. I tried to trace where everything had gone wrong, but the answers eluded me. I was torn between my duty to David and the consuming passion I felt for Jason. David had been the foundation of my life, the one constant that held me together for so many years. Yet, each passing day made it harder to feel that connection. Jason, on the other hand, was the embodiment of something new, forbidden, but inescapable. His words echoed in my mind, a reminder that I couldn't bring myself back to the past. By evening, I realized the choice was inevitable. This moment had been building for weeks, but I still didn't know which path to take. Each one seemed filled with loss. Each one meant sacrificing something I couldn't bear to let go. I sat with my head in my hands, feeling an overwhelming emptiness inside. This wasn't the silence that brings peace. It was a void. I woke early, feeling an unbearable weight in my chest, as though the night had delivered a decision I could no longer postpone. The house was silent, but not comforting. The quiet felt oppressive, and every sound seemed too loud. One question echoed in my mind. Who am I now? David was already in the kitchen, scrolling through something on his phone when I walked in. He glanced at me briefly but said nothing. His silence filled the room with a heaviness I couldn't escape. I tried to focus on mundane tasks, hoping the routine would distract me. But everything reminded me of what I had broken. By midday, I heard the front door slam shut. Jason. His suitcase stood by the entrance. This was the moment I had dreaded, and perhaps in some way anticipated. He didn't look at me, just stood there as if he already knew it was over. "You've made your decision," he said quietly, not as a question but as a statement. I nodded, unable to find the strength to speak. Everything inside me twisted painfully, but I knew this was the right thing to do. Jason waited for a response, but I could only offer silence. His eyes carried disappointment, but he said nothing more. He picked up his suitcase, turned, and walked out. The door closed, leaving me with a hollow ache. After he left, the house felt unbearable. The air grew heavier, the walls seemed to close in. I stood by the window watching as he got into his car and drove away. The moment felt like the end of an entire chapter of my life. I had chosen to stay with David, but the decision brought no relief. When David returned home that evening, he looked the same as always, but his movements carried a quiet caution. We spoke little, avoiding topics that might lead us back to the truth. His gaze lingered on me often, but I couldn't hold it for more than a few seconds. Lying in bed that night, I wondered how we would move forward. I had chosen to stay, but that didn't mean we could return to what we once were. Our relationship had changed, and perhaps the fracture would never fully heal. But Jason, his presence, his confidence, his words still echoed in my mind. As he left, he had taken a part of me with him, leaving a void that grew larger with each passing moment, filling me with doubt. By morning, I understood that my choice had been inevitable. I would stay with David, but it would be a new kind of life, one with new boundaries and unspoken rules. Still, part of me would remain where Jason had been, in the moment I chose to leave behind. Time passed slowly, as if each day carried the weight of my decision. David and I tried to rebuild what had been broken, but every conversation, every gesture felt forced. We lived as though afraid to look too closely at one another, fearing we'd find only emptiness. The trust between us was gone. David never spoke of it directly, but I saw it in his eyes. He tried to act as he always had, but his movements, the careful way he chose his words, revealed that the wound was still fresh. Dinner was quiet. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly had turned into brief exchanges about the house or work. His attention, once so genuine, now felt perfunctory, as if he were fulfilling a duty rather than sharing a life with me. I tried to restore our routine, but my efforts felt hollow even to myself. We took walks, occasionally watched movies together, But there was always something unspoken between us, a barrier that kept us from returning to what we once had. More often than not, I was left alone with my thoughts. I realized that staying with David had been the morally right choice, but it hadn't brought me happiness. Jason continued to occupy a corner of my mind. His voice, his touch, his confidence, they all returned to me in moments of silence, forcing me to question everything. I watched David as he tried to be present, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had become strangers. His trust in me was shattered, and I didn't know how to mend it. Perhaps it couldn't be mended. One evening, sitting in the living room, I suddenly felt that everything I was doing was an attempt to escape myself. I watched David reading the newspaper and thought about how far apart we had drifted. The silence between us had become a habit, almost a comfort. But within that silence, I felt an ever-growing void. One night, lying in bed, I realized that my choice had not brought relief, only more pain. I had stayed with David, but our relationship would never be the same. That thought lingered. At some point, I understood that I had lost not only Jason, but also myself. I sat on the edge of the lake, watching the gentle breeze ripple across the water. The sky was gray, mirroring my thoughts. I had come here seeking quiet, but inside there were too many questions I couldn't answer. Everything that had happened over the past months felt like it had trapped me in a loop. The choice I made seemed right, but it didn't make it any easier. Could David and I ever rebuild what we had lost? Did I even want to? Or was I just clinging to something familiar, too afraid to face the unknown? My reflection in the water felt foreign. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. Deep down, I knew I had lost myself, trying to balance duty and desire. Jason was gone, but his presence lingered. David was still here, but a chasm now lay between us. I thought about the life I had before all this. Were my feelings for David ever real? Or had we simply been drifting along until the storm came? Perhaps I could never go back to who I was before, but moving forward felt just as unbearable. The phone in my pocket buzzed, jolting me from my thoughts. The ringing cut through the stillness, but I didn't move. I didn't want to know who it was. It could have been David, Jason, or someone else entirely. It didn't matter. I kept my eyes on the water, watching the surface ripple with the wind. Answering wouldn't change anything. I knew that. The decisions I could make were beyond this moment. The wind picked up and I closed my eyes, feeling it brush against my face. I wanted to dissolve into the moment, to forget everything. But forgetting doesn't mean forgiving. Not myself, nor the choices I made. When I opened my eyes, the lake was as calm as before. The phone stopped ringing, but its silent vibration seemed to echo within me, a reminder that life moved on even when I wasn't ready for it. Still, I remained on the shore, my gaze fixed on the water. The answers didn't come, but I knew that more choices lay ahead. For now, I simply sat, listening to the wind and staring at the reflection I still couldn't recognize.